This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 846 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the trends this week, I want to remind you about the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. The Patreon's a place to get all sorts of rankings and tiers, along with live stream Q&As with yours truly, data dumps, a great Discord community, and more. There are two tiers of the Patreon, a $5 a month one and a $10 a month one. And you can join month to month. As I always say, I'm not trying to take all your money. I'm just trying to make a living. You can learn more about it over on lateround.com. Entering Week 13, Joe Mixon's lowest running back rush share of the season came all the way back in Week 1, where he saw 76.5% of Cincinnati's running back rushes. Against the Jags on Monday night, though, that number fell to 67.9%. His average entering that game was 91.5%. But the Bengals started using rookie Chase Brown more. Brown had a season-high 32% running back rush share. Now, it's good that the Bengals offense looks strong in Jacksonville because it's going to give Joe Mixon more scoring opportunities. But between the tough fantasy playoff schedule and this Chase Brown usage, Mixon to me is still more of a sell than a buy. Another backfield shift this week came for Carolina. And I think that's noteworthy because it was the Panthers' first game without Frank Reich this season. Chuba Hubbard ended up seeing 73.5% of the Panthers' running back rushes against the Bucs. During his two previous games, that number was about 48%. So the Panthers used Hubbard more on the ground, and that's great. But he didn't see a single target, and he ran a route on about 34% of Carolina's dropbacks. Now, to be fair, that route participation, it was pretty consistent with what he's been seeing with Miles Sanders in the lineup. So we should expect at least a slight bump in target share moving forward. Hubbard was productive last week. I'd expect him to continue being the 1A in that backfield with that new coaching staff. He was a Week 13 winner. Mitch Trubisky is now starting for the Steelers. That might not be a bad thing for Deontay Johnson. Trubisky started 5 games for Pittsburgh last season. In those games, Johnson averaged a target share per game rate of 32.2%. His PPR points per game output was 13.4. Out of that split, so without Mitch Trubisky, Johnson's target share went from 32% to 25.5%. His points per game went from 13.4 to 9.5. That's something to keep at least an eye on as Kenny Pickett heals. Austin Ekeler has not been good in fantasy football. He scored 7, 9.4, and 4.7 PPR points over his last 3. His lowest PPR total last season, it was 9, and that happened in Week 18 when fantasy football didn't even matter. So what's going on? How concerned should Austin Ekeler managers be? Well, we know that players coming off high ankle sprains, they'll often see a dip in production rest of season. And I do think that Ekeler's looked a little bit worse this season than last, just when you watch him. But it's not like every performance has been like this in 2023. He had a 3-game stretch from Week 8 through Week 10 where he scored 23, 21, and 22 PPR points. His peripherals really haven't been dramatically different of late. They were a little bit worse in Week 13 because of the weird game script they played in. His route participation was at a season low 43%, but I'm not overly concerned about his usage. I really think that when you look at recent performance, some of this has to do with the fact that they faced Baltimore. That was a tough opponent. And then, like I said, they had a weird game against New England. The offense didn't really have to do that much. I'm still more on the buy side than the sell side with Austin Ekeler. To close out the season, they get Denver, Vegas, Buffalo, and then Denver again. Those are some nice matchups overall. He may not have the same burst, but he can still be viable in fantasy football. Travis Kelce has been fine when compared to other tight ends this season, but he hasn't been his usual dominant self. He hasn't hit 16 PPR points in a game since Week 7. That's 5 straight games, maxing out at about 15 PPR points. Kelce's averaging 2 fewer PPR points per game year over year. We knew that some regression was going to come, so it's not that big of a surprise. But I think the tough part right now is that Kelce's production has just been trending downward. It's not like we've seen the elite Kelce every other week. We've just seen this mid-range tight end one week in and week out. I wish I had some sincere answer for you, aside from the fact that he's just not seeing the same volume as he did a year ago or even earlier this year, which is likely the result of the Chiefs having such bad options across the offense. Defenses can really hone in on Travis Kelce. His target share per game rate is just 20% over the stretch of bad games. That was closer to 27% to start the year. Last season, his target share per game rate was 25%. Now, I'd imagine the Chiefs are going to try to force things more with Kelce moving forward. But the entire offense is struggling. It's hard to imagine Kelce as the dominant force that he was last year. At least Kansas City's rest of season tight end schedule is 11th best, according to adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, speaking of Kansas City, I feel like I've talked about Rashee Rice 1,000 times in the 10 Trends episode this year, but here I go again. Rice has now seen a 30% target share in back-to-back games. According to Next Gen Stats routes data, his route participation in Week 13, it was a season-high 72%. So it's good that things are trending up. His route participation is getting a little bit better, just a little bit better, because 72% is still not that great. It's not very high for a number one wide receiver. The Chiefs are still rotating their wideouts. They need to stop this. They need to change something on offense, and I think that Rashee Rice could be that change. So definitely still hold on to him, and I do think that there's still a ceiling rest of season. Now, another backfield that saw some movement in Week 13 was Houston's. Even with Dameon Pierce back in Week 12, Devin Singletary played 82% of Houston's snaps, and he saw a season-high 19% target share. He ran a route on 80% of the Texans' dropbacks. This past week, his route participation was cut by more than half. His running back rush share dropped by almost 20 percentage points. His target share was just 3.8%. This isn't just some committee backfield where we know one guy is going to get like 60% of the team's backfield touches and another guy is going to get the remaining 40%. Like what we've seen with the Patriots this season. That's predictable. Obviously, Ramondre Stevenson's out now, but how they deployed their running backs was fairly predictable. This is a backfield, this Houston backfield, where it looks like it's going to be incredibly difficult to predict usage week in and week out. And that lowers the value for both Devin Singletary and Dameon Pierce. It was a fun 4 weeks for Devin Singletary, but he's now one of those I like him more in best ball type of players. I mentioned the utilization report over on fantasylife.com all the time on this show because it's free and I want people to dig into this stuff themselves. It's fun to get your hands dirty and do some analysis. But that utilization report also has a team section. It's not just for players. And there's something interesting to note with Pittsburgh. As we know, Matt Canada has been gone for 2 games. In those 2 games, the Steelers are playing at what the utilization report dubs as a slow pace. They only had 1 slow-paced game with Matt Canada calling things. Now, on top of that, their dropbacks over expected have been -7% and -13%. They're running the ball in situations where most teams throw it at a way higher than normal rate. Basically, what I'm saying is, overall, in order to get a real offensive overhaul for fantasy with the Pittsburgh Steelers, this team's going to have to change personnel, not just the coaches. On last week's mailbag episode, I was asked about which quarterback could essentially be a league winner this year, and I named 2 of them. The first was Justin Fields, who I talked about again on yesterday's 15 Transactions episode, and then there was Brock Purdy. Purdy then had a great game against Philadelphia, as we saw. Now, I'm not bringing that up to pat myself on the back. I'm bringing it up because my answer was dictated by schedule, by opponent. Purdy faced Philly. Philly has been a great matchup for quarterbacks this year in adjusted fantasy points allowed. He scored 29.5 standard points. Purdy has now faced 4 top 10 opponents by adjusted fantasy points allowed this year. He's averaged over 23 fantasy points per game in those contests. And like I said last week, he gets the Cardinals and the Commanders in the fantasy football playoffs. He does get Baltimore in the middle of those 2, but Arizona and Washington are both top 7 matchups for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Based on our sample this year, that should lead us to believe that Brock Purdy can easily be a QB1 in those matchups. The last trend this week is about the Cleveland Browns backfield. Jerome Ford's fantasy total, it was fine in week 14 because he had a receiving touchdown, but his usage really plummeted. Ford ended that game with a 39% running back rush share. That was his lowest since he was hurt back in week 8. His 7.3% target share was also a concern because he ran a route on just 39% of Cleveland's dropbacks. He's now had a sub 40% route participation in 2 of his last 3. He was well above that mark in his 2 games prior to this stretch. So I definitely have some concerns. The Browns used more Pierre Strong in week 13. He had a 14% snap share. That was his highest snap share in over a month. It's a small difference, but when you have a player like Ford, who's sort of a part-time player to begin with, all of those touches matter. Let's not overreact, but let's recognize that week 13 was different for this Cleveland Browns backfield. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB, the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram account at LateRoundFF, and the YouTube channel, youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Sleeper Show.